Good evening, Avon Grove Charter School community. I am Happy, one of the 7 dwarfs.
And I'm Sneezy. Achoo!
And we are here. We asked Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Hendrickson if we could take their place this weekend and celebrate the Halloween season and read the books to you. We heard that Kemblesville, you guys had a really busy week. This past week, there was a very successful and fun skating party. I wish I could have been there, so that would have been a lot of fun and made me even more happy. I heard we had a wolf pack party that celebrated the gold dollar winners and all of the other friends who earned wolf tickets this month, some of the friends that were selected for the party. And then I heard that we had some assemblies that we're celebrating some things that were learned for our pack over the past several weeks.
And I heard that 3rd grade went to the YMCA for their splash swim sessions. 2 days of swimming.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Water makes me very sneezy though.
Yeah. Oh, it does?
It does.
Yeah. Well, it makes me very happy that they learned safety skills for the water.
Absolutely.
Very happy. Right, so now we have the rest of the book, I think.
I heard from Mrs. Hendrickson that we're going to finish this book today, the Sleepy Hollow book. And last she said Ichabod was courting Katrina and that they were going over there for a very big party. Ichabod was very excited. He even took a horse with him, I think he said, from the farmer he was staying with. So we're going to finish this book today. I can't wait to hear what happens to Ichabod. Chapter 11, More Ghostly Tales. When the dancing was over, Ichabod joined a group of farmers and their wives out on the porch. They were telling stories about the Revolutionary War and gossiping about local hauntings. But even the drama of the war stories was nothing compared to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that followed. One ghost story told of the great tree where Major Andre had been in a large battle. Every night since the battle, a ghostly funeral train passed by the great old tree. The ghosts were miserable and their howls and wailings could be heard for miles. Then there was a story of a woman in white. She had perished near Raven Rock during a bitter winter storm. And before any storm, you could hear her shrieks carried along by the fiercely whipping winds. But of all the ghost tales that Mr. Van Tassel's party, none were as terrifying as those about the Headless Horseman. Rumor had it that the Headless Horseman had been out and about more than usual lately. He continued to patrol the country, looking for his head and tying his horse to a tree in the Sleepy Hollow graveyard every night. Near the graveyard was a wooden bridge that crossed a babbling brook. A thick mass of trees covered both the bridge and the road that led to it. During the day, the bridge was a spooky place, but at night it was downright terrifying. It was also the favorite haunt of the Headless Horseman. The first Headless Horseman tale was the one about old Brower, who was always insisting that there was no such thing as ghosts. Apparently, the Headless Horseman wanted to prove Brower wrong. One evening, Brower was returning from Sleepy Hollow and met the horseman. The ghost commanded that Brower get up on his horse with him. Terrified for his life, Brower obliged. Together, the two raced across the countryside on the back of the black steed. The horse traveled so fast that Brower could barely tell where they were going. When they reached the bridge near the graveyard, the Headless Horseman suddenly turned into a glowing skeleton. With a bony hand, he pushed old Brower into the brook and then disappeared. While most of the listening crowd nodded gravely at the end of the tale, there was one man who bursted out laughing. It was Brom Bones, who had his own tale of the Headless Horseman. Being an expert rider himself, Brom was quick to refer to the Headless Horseman as some sort of inexperienced rider. Brom told about the time that he had come across the Headless Horseman upon his return from a neighboring village. The horseman wanted to race with him for a bowl of punch. Of course, Brom was willing to take the bet. The two tore through the night at lightning speed, over fences and fallen trees, through forests and across the fields. Brom was riding Daredevil and declared that the horseman's steed was no match for his horse. Brom was about to win the race as they came to the church bridge. But a second later, just before the bridge, the headless horseman disappeared in a flash of light. The people oohed and whispered to one another when Brom finished his story. "A flash of light," someone whispered. "Into thin air," another. "Gone but due to return," muttered a third. Ichabod, having heard Brom's tale, felt pressed to add his own stories to the mix. He rambled on about the mischievous events that he had witnessed in his home state of Connecticut, as well as the fearful sights he had seen in his walks through Sleepy Hollow. As he wove his tales of dread, poor Ichabod did not know that the most fearsome sight of all was still to come. Chapter 12, Into the Night. Late in the night, the Van Tassel party broke up. The farmers gathered their families in their wagons and set out over the hills and fields. Some of the young men sat with their ladies on their horses, and they cheerfully rode home together. Ichabod remained behind to visit with Katrina, as it was custom. While he waited for her, he whistled happily. He was sure that he was on the road to success. When Ichabod came out of the meeting with Katrina, though, it was clear that something had gone wrong. Nobody knew exactly what had happened, because the meeting was private. But when Ichabod appeared again, he did not smile. He did not pause to grab a last morsel from the overflowing tea table. He did not gaze lovingly at the beautiful farmhouse. Instead, Ichabod went straight to the stable and roughly woke up old Gunpowder, who was enjoying a restful snooze in a cozy stall. Ichabod seemed to be so upset over Katrina that he didn't notice how dark it was. As he rode along the banks of the Hudson, blackness surrounded him. A dog barked in the faraway distance, but there was nearly no sight of life. Ichabod slumped in his saddle. He was all alone. The night grew darker and darker. The stars seemed to sink deeper into the sky. As Ichabod approached a familiar place in the road, his mind flooded with stories that he had heard just a few hours earlier. Suddenly afraid, Ichabod began to whistle. For a moment he thought his whistle had been answered. Looking up, Ichabod saw a white figure above him. He inhaled sharply. But it was only a place in the tree where lightning had struck and revealed the white wood. Ichabod groaned, and his teeth began to chatter. Ichabod heavily sighed of relief when he rode on, leaving the tree behind. He was safe, but he still had a long ride ahead of him. Chapter 13, The Last Ride. Not far from the tree, a small brook crossed the road. The brook trickled into a marshy area known as Willie's Swamp. And like the bridge near the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, the area around the bridge was overgrown with bushes and vines. It was certainly a gloomy place. Crossing the bridge at night was a challenge for even the bravest soul, for this was the exact spot where Major Andre had been taken. The men who had done it had hid in the thick of the undergrowth. Ichabod steeled his resolve and gave Gunpowder a firm kick to urge him onward. But instead of sprinting across the bridge, the wayward horse started to the side and crashed sideways into a fence. Tightening the reins further still, Ichabod kicked Gunpowder again. The horse dashed forward, snuffing and snorting. But a second later, he stopped short, right in front of the bridge. Ichabod nearly flew over the horse's head. At that moment, something stopped in the water on the side of the bridge. In the dark shadows next to the water, Ichabod spotted a figure, huge, towering, and misshapen. The figure did not move. It stood there, as if waiting for its prey. The hair on the back of Ichabod's neck rose again. What could he do? If he tried to flee, the figure would certainly catch him. Summoning all of his courage, Ichabod cleared his throat and said, "Who are you?" But the apparition did not answer. Ichabod kicked Gunpowder, and the horse started across the bridge. As a panicked Ichabod neared the black figure, he did the only thing he could think of. He broke into a psalm tune. The black figure moved. Suddenly it was in the middle of the road, straight ahead. Though the night was very dark, Ichabod could now see that the figure was a horseman of some kind. But the horse and the rider were large and strong looking. Ichabod kept a tight rein on Gunpowder and urged the horse forward around the figure. But the silent black horseman followed him. Ichabod slowed his horse, but the other rider did the same. Ichabod had momentarily stopped singing and now wanted to start again, but his mouth was so dry he could not squeak out a single note. As the dark rider continued to follow him, Ichabod's heart sank into his chest. He was in terrible trouble. And then, as they came over a little hill and into open air, Ichabod turned and got a better look at the horseman. Unable to stop himself, he gasped aloud. The man was headless, and a pumpkin head was riding in the saddle in front of its owner. Ichabod Crane was face to face with the headless horseman of Sleepy Hollow. He shuddered in horror and kicked Gunpowder hard. His horse took off in a gallop, but the other steed was quick to follow. Ichabod's clothes fluttered behind him as he leaned forward on the horse, pressing the animal on. Finally, Ichabod came to the fork in the road that led to Sleepy Hollow. Just at that fork, Gunpowder made an abrupt turn and plunged downhill, heading straight for the Headless Horseman's bridge. Ichabod tried to remain calm, but during his frantic ride, Gunpowder's saddle had somehow gotten loose. Now it was falling off. Ichabod made a desperate attempt to hold the saddle on the horse. It was no use. He had a single second to grab Gunpowder around the neck before the saddle crashed to the ground. A moment later, he heard the Headless Horseman trample over it. For a split second, Ichabod worried about the wrath of Hans Van Ripper. It was a good saddle, but a snort came from the black steed on his heels, reminding him that he had much bigger problems to worry about. Still clutching Gunpowder's neck, Ichabod quickly looked up. The bridge was just a short way ahead, and beyond it was the church. Ichabod remembered the story Brom Bones had told at the Van Tassel party. The Headless Horseman had vanished just at the bridge. If Ichabod could make it that far, he would be safe. But the black steed was closing in. He could feel its hot breath on his neck. Ichabod kicked Gunpowder yet again, and the old horse sprang across the bridge. Ichabod looked back to see the horseman vanish into a flash of smoke and light. But he didn't. Instead, the Headless Horseman rose up in his stirrups and hurled his horrible pumpkin head at Ichabod. Ichabod ducked, but it was too late. He was hit on the back of the head. A second later, he crashed to the ground. Chapter 14. The Mystery of Ichabod Crane. The next morning, Gunpowder appeared at his master's gate. He wore no saddle. Ichabod Crane did not appear for breakfast. He was not at the supper table. His students gathered at the schoolhouse, but there was no one there to teach him. By the end of the day, Hans Van Ripper began to worry. He was worried about Ichabod and also about his beautiful saddle. A search party was organized. Traveling on foot, they scoured the area. It did not take them long to find the traces of the previous night's events. The saddle was trampled in the mud. Ichabod's hat was lying on the edge of the brook next to the deep black water, and next to the hat laid a shattered pumpkin. The brook was carefully searched, but the body of Ichabod Crane was never found. His few worldly possessions, some clothes, a book of psalm tunes, a broken pitcher pipe, and of course the New England's History of Witchcraft, was thrown away. The school was moved to another part of Sleepy Hollow. Naturally, the people of Tarrytown talked a lot about the fate of poor Ichabod. Gossip and gazers gathered in the churchyard on Sundays and at the edge of the brook where the pumpkin and Ichabod's hat were found. The tales of Old Brower and Brom Bones were repeated, and when all had been told and retold, the people of Sleepy Hollow came to the conclusion that poor Ichabod had been carried off by the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. But of course, there were other rumors about what had happened to Ichabod. One local farmer was positive that the schoolmaster was so afraid of running into the Headless Horseman that he simply left town. The farmer reported that Ichabod had moved to New York. He had supposedly become a lawyer and a politician and was doing very well for himself. As for Brom Bones, he escorted Katrina to the altar shortly after Ichabod's disappearance. And whenever Brom heard folks talk about Ichabod and the Headless Horseman, especially about the part about the pumpkin, he would laugh out loud. Some people believe that Brahm knew a lot more about the disappearance of Ichabod than he would admit, but nobody could prove it. The old Dutch housewives held firm. Whenever any discussion about Ichabod's disappearance arose, they declared that he had been carried off by the Headless Horseman. By now, the story of Ichabod Crane had become quite famous. It was an old favorite, guaranteed to bring chills whenever told around the crackling fire on a cold winter's night. And as the people of Tarrytown headed home after a night of terrible tales, they often heard whooping hooves echoing in the night, and those who listened very closely might sometimes even hear a low, sad psalm tune carried along by the wind, the long-forgotten voice of Ichabod Crane.
Wow.
The end. What a great way to end.
That was a good way to end. Wow, I really enjoyed listening to that. I wish I would have been here every week with Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Hendrickson.
Me too. I think I'm going to ask if I can borrow it and read it from the beginning.
I think that would be great. Well, thank you guys for joining us. We are so happy to be the visiting guest this week. I know next week I hear there's even many more fun fall events happening.
That's right. Mrs. Johnson invited us to come back for the fall harvest on Thursday. We're really excited to come back.
Yeah, so we'll be here peeking in all the classrooms and seeing all of the different things kids are wearing and how the teachers are celebrating this fall festival, fall harvest. So thanks everybody, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Good night.
Bye-bye.